There's so many rooms that I walk into where I'm the only person who looks like me. And so one of the things that I really try to be intentional about is like whenever I'm talking about mental health, there's part of my physical appearance that is South Asian or South Asian inspired. If it's jewelry, if it's wearing a kurti, sometimes wearing a bindi, like really tuning into that part of me in a way that can't be overlooked.
Welcome to Spread the Light with Dr. Devika B., where we unpack stigma, stereotypes, and bias, because stigma festers in the dark and it scatters in the light. You know me well by now. I'm your host, Dr. Devika Bhushan. I'm a pediatrician, a public health practitioner, a parent to a toddler, an immigrant to the U.S. by way of India and the Philippines, and somebody who lives openly with bipolar disorder. I'm really thrilled to be welcoming to the show my friend, Pooja Mehta. She serves as Senior Associate of Activist Engagement at Inseparable, and she serves with me on the National Board of Directors at NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. She's been an advocate in the mental health space since she was 19 years old. She's shared her own mental health journey in a variety of different domains and lives openly with anxiety with auditory hallucinations, depression, and is a suicide loss survivor. Thanks for being here, Pooja.
Thank you so much, Devika. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with what elements of your personal journey led you to becoming a mental health advocate?
You know, I have been an advocate for almost 10 years since I was 19, but I have lived with my diagnoses for 15. And those first 4 years, I was having severe symptoms, hearing voices, following through on what they were telling me to do. And my parents noticed that something was wrong and got me the help that I needed. But where I grew up was a very tight-knit South Asian community. And because of fear of cultural stigma and backlash against me, my parents told me that, don't tell anybody about this, which I know from their perspective, it was the best thing. They were trying to protect me, but it fed into this already existing self-stigma that, this isn't something that I want to have. This isn't something that I want to be. And I really just rejected any idea that I needed help and didn't engage in my care.
What does it feel like to have an auditory hallucination? So it's been a while since I've had one, thankfully. I would liken it to, being in a crowded cafeteria. You have all of these people talking and there's kind of this low murmur, but you're not really able to piece out any of the conversations. Now, keep in mind, this is happening when I'm entirely by myself. It starts off like that, kind of in my head. And then some of the voices become a little bit more clear, a little bit more defined. And they're saying things like, nobody loves you, nobody cares about you. It would be better if you weren't here. And those voices, if the panic attack progresses, get louder and louder and louder until it's the only thing that I'm hearing. It's the only thing that's real for me anymore.
When I went to college, I had a panic attack. And my friend who I went to when I was struggling, I don't really know what happened, but she went to the administration of the school and I got an email from the administration saying that I've been reported as a danger to myself and need to be removed from campus.
Oh, wow.
And that just unlocked so many things in me. Here was the first time that I had openly talked about this to somebody else. Here was the response from my peer. Here was the response from a very reputable university. And, the first time I ever told my story on my own terms was like defending my right to stay on campus and continue my education. The first time I ever told my story to anyone who wasn't a trusted person in my life was to a bunch of administrators saying why I shouldn't leave campus. And I didn't like that. And so every time I've told my story since, it's, there's two sides of it. One is making sure people understand what it is and what it isn't, and that there are parts of my story that are not great. And we need to be doing things to make sure that that doesn't happen to anybody. And then there are parts of my story that are hopeful, that are positive, that are, really just contradicting this idea that people have in their head when they think about people with mental illnesses. But the other side of that is taking the power back for myself. The very first time that I had to be open about all of this, it was not my decision. And so every time I get to tell my story on my own terms, on my own volition, it is taking a little bit of that back and healing that part that was taken away from me.
Wow. When you're thinking back to that first time that you had to share in the setting of administrators who may or may not have understood who you were and what the story really meant in the context of your life, how did you go from the self-stigma, the shame, the difficulty around that first telling of your narrative to being so comfortable, so open? How did that journey happen for you?
Yeah, so shortly after that experience, I was really frustrated. I was venting to a friend, and he pointed out that, if I am not going to tell my story fully, openly, then people are going to fill in the gaps the only way they know how. And so I wrote an op-ed in my school's newspaper, and it was anonymous, but so many people responded to it. So many people said, I feel the same way. I definitely know what this feels like. Just a lot of like, yeah, me too. And it made me see that maybe the fact that I'm dealing with this is not entirely a bad thing. Maybe it's not a bad thing at all, And it led me to co-found the NAMI on campus at my undergrad and connect with people in a positive way around this for the first time in my life. And it just went from there. I was able to see the positive impact that telling my story could have and the way that it can not only help people, but also made me rethink the way that I see myself and I see my mental illnesses. And I actually started engaging in care for the first time in my life.
That is so incredibly powerful. And it's a nice segue to the work that you do on a daily basis. So can you give us a snapshot of, what does Inseparable do and what do you do there?
Absolutely. So Inseparable is a national nonprofit where we support lawmakers at the state and federal level to pass policies that support mental health. We focus specifically in the areas of early intervention and prevention, a better crisis system of care, and then increasing access to care, which can include everything from insurance reforms to workforce development to, anything that structurally prohibits people from being able to get the care that they need. And for me, the reason that I wanted to shift into more of a policy space was because at the grassroots level, I'm telling my story. And at the time, I was one of a handful of South Asians who was even speaking openly about this. And I was getting so many people coming to me like in DMs and emails saying that they were struggling too, and they didn't know how to build up the courage to get help or build up the courage to tell their family or take that next step of improving what was going on with them. And I would spend weeks, sometimes months with people, talking to them, getting them to the point where they were comfortable, their families were comfortable, seeking resources and really engaging in a system of care. And about a third of the time, I would be faced with, we can't find a provider who takes our insurance, or I can't afford my deductible, or I can't attend sessions because I can't get time off work. Like all of those issues that I could not fix on an individual level. And I was like, what are we even doing here? Okay, we've got these social barriers, like the social stigma, we have the cultural stigma, but how is the system like this? It was a really stark indicator to me that the fact that I never had to personally navigate those barriers was purely a product of privilege and purely a product of resources, which no, healthcare should not be like that. Mental health care should not be like that. So we support lawmakers in a variety of ways. One of the most fundamental things that I do is just keep tabs on what's going on in the country. Like what pieces of legislation have been introduced, what pieces of legislation are moving, and where can we invest our resources in a way that makes the most impact for the most people when it comes to truly providing mental health system reforms. We have a mental health caucus where legislators are welcome to join and learn from each other and learn from experts in the field around ways that they can bring innovative mental health solutions to their states. We partner with several organizations who already have established networks on the ground in amplifying the work that they're doing and getting those legislative priorities that they care about through the finish line. And, really just serving as a resource. Mental health from a policy perspective is a relatively new thing, and really making people understand that the people who represent you in so many different ways can do something about this, and really encouraging them to hold that truth to power and telling them you need to do something about this. It doesn't have to be this way, and you have the power to change that.
And part of your role too is to help people figure out how to tell their stories in a way that compels action. And so thinking about that and thinking about all of your experiences, honing those skills, what are some of your top tips for people who are just coming online, just learning about how to distill the pieces of their story down into the most actionable insights and how to use those stories to compel action?
Absolutely. One of the things that I tell people in any kind of storytelling setting is the entirety of your story belongs to you. And it is up to you to decide who needs to or even deserves to hear parts of it. For me, there are parts of my story that you Google my name and you know it. And there are other parts that are still between me and my therapist. And I am the only one who is the keeper of the entirety of my story. When talking to people and sharing your story in this specific context, what's really important is efficiency, right? What is the part of your story that directly relates to the ask that you're trying to make? And making that point as quickly as possible, because especially when you're talking to legislators, they have hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who want their attention and who want their consideration. So how are you able to tie your story as efficiently as possible to the issue that you want them to act on? That's one part of it. And then the other part of it is it's hard, especially when you're talking about something so personal, but you almost have to decenter yourself from it. For me, when I'm telling my story in an advocacy setting, I'm almost thinking of it as somebody else's story, because if I think about it as my own, I get very emotional. I get very compassionate. I'm like, this is my heart speaking to your heart, the way that I would in a support group, the way that I would like if I'm talking to a friend. But that's not necessarily the energy that the legislator is looking for, right? They want to hear that here's this story that is going to pull on my heartstrings, but here's how it ties into this bigger picture, and here's how I can use it to make an impact for the people that I have been chosen to represent.
That is super interesting. So telling that story as if it happened to somebody else helps take some of that emotion really out of it so that you can package it in a way that connects to a rational framework and a specific policy point or proposal.
Yeah, and I mean, to each their own, right? But for me personally, if I really truly get into the feelings of what my story is and really truly feel like the emotional power that my story has on me and relive that, there's so much that I want to say that in the limited time and the limited attention that I get, I'm not going to make a lot of progress. I could talk about my story for hours, but having been on the receiving end of that, like as a staffer in a congressional office, we have 30 minutes, right? And I need to have something in my hand that I could take back to my boss to get her to do this. So the pain that I'm feeling from the people who are talking to me, the pain that I might be giving by telling my story, it's powerful and it's moving, but it's not something that I can take back to my boss and say, we need to act on this because this person is struggling. I really need to be able to make the case as to how it ties into the bigger picture. And I think having efficient storytelling skills can really help bridge those two, because ultimately the goal when you're telling your story in this session is not so that that legislator knows your story. It's so that that legislator will make a decision that will prevent stories like yours from having to happen again.
Right. And how do you know when a story is ready to be told or when you are ready to tell a particular aspect of your story, right? Like you talked about, the whole story is yours and it's your decision which pieces to share with whom at what times. So what signals to you or to somebody that this piece of the story is ready to be shared?
I think for every single person, it's different. For me, it's kind of litmus testing with my circles of trust. Right? I have the people who are my immediate inner circle. I have my close friends. I have my acquaintances. I have, my network, and then I have the general public. And for me, if I feel comfortable telling components of my story through all of those levels, that's when it's at the point where it's like, yeah, you want me to speak on this in an interview? You want me to speak on this in a presentation? I can do that. It's really being conscious and shout out to my therapist about what are the emotional responses that are coming out of me when I'm telling the story. That's a big signal of whether I'm ready to take it to the next level or not. I'll give you an example. Like at the top of this podcast, I spoke very openly about what happened at university and like the advocacy work since. I don't talk a lot about those 4 years before I started speaking openly about my diagnosis. I don't really talk about what it was like being in high school and suffering in silence. And I don't really share that part of my story openly because I'm still healing from it. And one thing that I like to be careful of is that if I'm telling my story, it's intentional, it's deliberate, it's, purposeful. It's not a trauma dump on the person who's listening to me. And figuring out what parts of that part of my life I'm able to speak about without having such powerful emotional responses that all just come spewing out like a fire hydrant versus which ones are still in the works and are things that I might be comfortable sharing with a friend or venting about or talking about in a support group, but maybe not necessarily like presenting to the world as a part of my story.
So it sounds like just being really, really tuned in with your own emotional responses to the telling of that story, and whether it is something that you've healed from and processed and packaged in some meaningful way versus you're still in the thick of that, of the healing, of the processing, of the figuring out what it all means for you. And so it's almost much easier to unpack something with somebody else in a setting where you're making connections to kind of the rational, cerebral takeaway or implications. But you can't do that if you're in the middle, unraveling that for yourself and understanding that emotionally. So that's a really powerful takeaway in terms of when and how and what people are able to say, and really like how to know for themselves when they're ready.
Absolutely. And, just pointing out that healing is not linear, right? A reminder that I really love to share with people is that even if you have shared parts of your story previously, healing is not linear. There might be something going on in your life right now that makes it hard to speak about that specific thing. And, even if you talked about it previously, even if you've shared it openly with a lot of people, it is still entirely your story, and therefore you can take it back. Right? You're allowed to say that actually right now when I'm talking about my story, maybe this isn't really something that I want to necessarily dive into. You never need to share more than you feel comfortable. Nobody is nobody is owed your story. It is your story to share how and when you see fit.
Right. And that's such a powerful point too, Pooja. You may have shared something with somebody before. It may even have been a public forum, like a podcast or a piece of writing, but on any given day, in any given moment or conversation, it is still your prerogative to say, hey, today I'm just not feeling like going there. And that is 100% okay. Like you said, the healing process is not linear. You can be back in the middle of something because of something that happened the day before. Totally. And, thinking about your experiences as a suicide loss survivor, what would you share to the community at large around what prevention efforts should look like, what the rhetoric should look like, and your advice to other survivors as well?
So I lost my brother Raj to suicide coming up on 4 years. And up until that point, I had been in the mental health advocacy space for a very long time. I have a mental health first aid certificate saying that I can identify the signs and symptoms of suicide dated 4 weeks to the day that he died. I knew the signs, I knew the symptoms, I had the handbook. None of them were there. And while previously, when I was doing mental health advocacy work, I subscribed to this idea that suicide is a final step in a mental illness and a mental health challenge. But the thing is, with my brother, he didn't have a diagnosed mental illness. He didn't have an undiagnosed mental illness. He did not, there were no signs, there were no symptoms. There was nothing that we could find on his phone, on his laptop, on anything that indicated that he was struggling to the point that he would consider taking his own life. The very last text message he ever sent was 20 minutes before I found him. And it was a text message to his lab partner asking how to divide up the homework questions. I'll take 1 through 15, you take 16 through 30.
Wow.
You don't send a message like that if you're anticipating being dead 20 minutes later. And, it's really changed the way that I think about suicide prevention. I think struggling with mental health and mental illness is part of that equation, but I think there is a lot more that we don't understand about suicide. We don't know about what drives people to do this, because on the flip side, you see people in just these awful, horrendous situations, and there's just an unbreakable will to live. Right? So what is that differential? What is that yes versus no that causes people to attempt versus not? And I just really get frustrated by this narrative of suicide is preventable, full stop, because I know it's a message of hope. I know it's a message of optimism. But for me, and from what I've heard from other survivors, the unspoken part of that question is, so why didn't you prevent it? And if you are in a situation like mine, how could I have?
And it creates these feelings of guilt that survivors have to contend with, because you're right, it's not in every single circumstance are there signs. The lists that we have of what to look out for and how to prevent suicide, those lists are incomplete.
Yeah.
Right.
And I want to be very, very clear. I would say more than the general public, me and other people of the survivor community want a world without suicide. We know this pain. We know just how debilitating it can be and how hard it is to fight to keep going afterwards. And we don't want anybody to ever have to experience that. But we do not know enough about suicide to even begin to have the conversation of what a world without suicide looks like. We know some things that work. We know that lethal means restriction works. We know that signs and symptoms are present in some cases. We need to keep advocating and keep making people aware of those solutions, but also recognize that it is part of the solution. And then there's whole other part here that we don't really know and we need to dive into more. We need to shed some light on it and really just uncover what's going on there so that we truly can achieve that world without suicide.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those perspectives, because as you know, being staunchly in this community and hearing all of the messages, being trained in mental health first aid, et cetera, that your perspective is one that doesn't get heard enough. Thank you.
I appreciate it. And while we're talking about suicide prevention, part of the conversation needs to be, are we creating a world where people are hopeful about their futures? Do we have a society, a civilization, a world where people want to stay? People feel like it's worth fighting, and I know that part of it can be driven by, mental health challenges, but I think it's really important, and this is something that I've just been noodling on quite a bit lately, is when you're struggling with your mental health, is it something wrong with you, or is it you responding appropriately to horrendous situations that you are put in? And I remember pretty distinctly in the year after my brother died, that was the first and only time in my life that I actively wanted to die. It was too hard. It was too painful. And I remember talking to my therapist and saying that, something is wrong with me. I'm feeling this way, blah, blah, blah. And she just pointed out everything that I was dealing with. She was like, you have been faced with situation after situation after situation that it is making it hard for you to realize that there is a future beyond this. Of course you are feeling this way. So part of it was not necessarily like, oh, you need to change the way that you think. It's you need to get out of these situations. You need to change your circumstances in a way that actually lets you see that there is hope worth staying around for. And I think the bigger those challenges are, the more encompassing those circumstances are, the more intentional we as a society need to be about addressing them. Otherwise, we're just going to keep hearing versions of the same story.
Right. It sounds like your therapist and you have this amazing relationship and you've been able to process a lot with her. And so in addition to therapy, what are some of the other day-to-day strategies that you use to maintain your mental health and get better when you're in a moment of feeling lower or having red flags emerge?
Fresh air is huge for me. It's one of those things that I kind of take for granted and one of those things that I'm not very intentional about going outside, taking a walk around the block, but it that more than anything can just completely switch my mindset and completely switch my mood. Community, like having people in your life who are worth sticking around for. I would say more than anything, what got me through that period of suicidality was staying alive for the people who love me until I got to the point where I could stay alive for myself. And I just will never be able to thank them enough, because they reminded me in so many ways and so many moments that I was important to them, that they loved me, and that, if I wasn't around, they would be in pain. And I couldn't do that to them, especially knowing what it feels like to lose someone that way. And then just, treat yourself, right? Life is short. We don't know what tomorrow brings. So if there's something that you want to do, if there's something that you're on the fence about, if there's something that is going to bring you joy, I should probably put an asterisk on that because I might be treating myself a little bit too much. My doctor wants me to watch my diet. But if there's that thing that you've been saving for a special occasion that's been sitting on your shelf for 3 years, build in those special occasions, those moments of the glimmers, if you will, because, the world is hard, life is hard, things are hard, and you deserve to support yourself and care for yourself and love yourself beyond what anybody else can give you.
I love that. And how do you feel like being South Asian, having the experiences you did early on around stigma in our community, how has that shaped your experiences and your journey?
So my identity as a South Asian woman has heavily shaped the way that I think about myself in the context of the mental health advocacy world, right? I'm sure that you can resonate with this. There's so many rooms that I walk into where I'm the only person who looks like me. There are so many places that I go to, and I give talks and I give presentations, and I'm the only name that they're stumbling on. And even in South Asian spaces, I'm the only one who is speaking about my mental illness, and sometimes to the chagrin of the people in the room that, like, oh no, this isn't something that we deal with. You just need to do more yoga. And it's like this weird middle, like not quite here, not quite there. But I think taking something that's been an insecurity for a long time and turning it into an asset, being like, okay, well, I don't like that there's a middle ground here. I don't like that it's like in this space I'm this and in that space I'm that. Why can't we bring the two together? You know? And so one of the things that I really try to be intentional about is, like, whenever I'm talking about mental health, I'm wearing something, there's part of my physical appearance that is South Asian or South Asian inspired. If it's jewelry, if it's wearing a kurti, if it's, sometimes wearing a bindi, really tuning into that part of me in a way that can't be overlooked. And then also in South Asian spaces, being very intentional about, no, I want to have this conversation and I want to talk to you as a South Asian person. I want to talk to you as an auntie or uncle about this topic. And I want to do it in a way from a place of compassion, from a place of understanding, in a way that invites you into the conversation rather than calling you out for not already being a part of it. So many of the people that I see when they think and talk about the South Asian community and mental health, it's kind of like, there's too much stigma there. We don't want to deal with it. Okay, there is a lot of stigma there, but having South Asian parents, I will tell you, they can be some of the most kind, the most caring people in the entire world, and they will do anything for their children.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means that reminding them that getting your child the help that they need, getting help for yourself so that you can be a better parent, is doing the best for them,
Wow. Yeah. And, so much of what you're sharing really deeply resonates with me too as a South Asian. And I can tell you, before I made my public disclosure, a lot of well-meaning community members, extended family members who had heard about the fact that I was considering doing it and said, you definitely should not, right? And I got those messages in many places in the South Asian community because we are, for better or for worse, pallbearers of our diaspora, of the immigrant community in the US. And there's a way in which people want for that to be this shiny, sort of ideal version of what a person can be. And there still is a deep level of shame around experiences of illness and specifically mental illness that are hidden. And I love how much intentionality you put into bringing even a visual piece of your South Asian identity into spaces and rooms where you're the only person who looks like you, having conversations openly about what it takes to have a world where everybody has the resources, the access, the opportunity to have optimal mental health.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where if I could go into every community and drive change like this, I would. But part of it is understanding what I can and cannot speak on. And, the only thing that I can speak on from a place of authority is being South Asian American. So we'll start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So last question, what can we do as a collective to ensure a better future?
This is going to sound so cliche and so cheesy, but I really want us to get to a point where we can truly plug into the fact that for every action, for every decision, for every step that we take, there is another person, a whole person with a life, a family, a heart, a brain, all of those things on the other side of that. Really just cutting through the noise and understanding that there are people on both sides of a conversation and that we really have more in common with each other than not. After Raj died, he died 2 weeks short of his birthday, and every year on his birthday, since I can't celebrate with him, I choose to do a day of good in his name and in his memory. And last year, I formally invited people to join in. And one of the biggest pieces of feedback that I got was like, I went out of my way to be kind to someone else or to put good into the world. And, even if it was just marginal, the only way you participate is on April 15th, do something good. Wherever you are, however you want, do something good. And the number of people that told me how good it made them feel to put that good energy into the world, to be a little bit more intentional about being kind to somebody, to be a little bit more connected to someone through an act of kindness or something like that, it made me feel really good. And I want more of that. I want more of taking that person who you think you could never agree on with anything and giving them a Hershey kiss, telling them that you like their shoes, like something that is just a small moment of genuine kindness and connection, because I truly believe that that can be the start of a much bigger network of understanding of compassion and kindness that we can all use to make a better world in the future.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Pooja, for all of your thoughts and for everything that you do to make this world a kinder, better, more connected place.
Thank you so much.